The threads. The itch was small at first, a faint prickling on the underside of my arm, nothing worth noticing. I scratched it absent-mindedly, distracted by the soft hum of the microwave and the stale scent of leftover pasta. My days bled together like this, quiet, monotonous, predictable. I welcomed the distraction, but the itch didn't stop. By the time I set the plate down at my cluttered table, it had spread, sharp and insistent. It was under my skin, deeper than a mosquito bite. Scratching didn't help. If anything, it made it worse, my nails dragging against the flesh until it flushed red. I finally looked. At first, I thought it was a shadow, a dark speck beneath the surface of my arm, small enough to ignore. But when I shifted under the light, it caught a faint gleam, like a sliver of glass embedded in my skin. I leaned closer. Not glass. It was a hair. Not the fine, translucent kind that covered my arms, but thick and black, wiry enough to look out of place. I frowned, pressing the tip of my finger against it, testing the way it bent under pressure. It didn't hurt. Not yet. The tweezers were in the bathroom cabinet. I fetched them quickly, drawn by the kind of compulsion that had me picking at scabs or smoothing frayed carpet edges. Things had to be fixed, removed, restored to order. I grabbed the hair with the tweezers, its coarse texture rough against the metal. I pulled. It resisted at first, tugging against the skin in a way that made me pause. I exhaled slowly, gripping tighter, and pulled harder. It slid free. The sensation wasn't painful, but it wasn't pleasant either. It was deep, the hair embedded far beyond what should have been possible. I kept pulling, watching as the strand emerged inch by inch, glistening under the light. My stomach turned. It wasn't a hair. The strand was too thick, too wet, coated in a faint black sheen that smeared against my fingers. It smelled faintly of something sweet and rotten, like meat left in the sun too long. I dropped it instinctively, my chest tight, nausea rising in waves. The strand landed on the floor with a soft, wet sound, coiling in on itself like a dying worm. I looked down at my arm. The pore where it had emerged was still open, wider than it should have been, the edges swollen and red. A faint, dark line lingered beneath the skin, trailing upward toward my elbow. The itch wasn't gone. It was worse. It came back stronger. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the room drowning in shadows. My skin crawled with a sensation I couldn't scratch away, deeper than before. It moved in waves under my ribs, over my legs, and up my neck, like something burrowing just beneath the surface. I rubbed my arms compulsively, trying to smother the feeling. My fingertips brushed something stiff. Another thread. It was just below my collarbone, black and taut, glinting faintly in the dim light of the room. I sat up slowly, swallowing the bile rising in my throat. My hand hovered over it, trembling, before I forced my fingers to grip it. It felt warm this time. I stumbled to the bathroom, dragging my feet across the cold tile, my breath hitching in shallow gasps. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, bathing the room in harsh, flickering brightness. In the mirror, my reflection stopped me. I looked wrong. My skin was pale, almost translucent, streaked with dark smudges where sweat and something else had clung to me. My eyes were hollow, ringed with red, darting nervously between the marks on my neck and chest. But it wasn't the pallor that held me in place. It was the lines under my skin. Thin, black veins stretched beneath the surface, branching out from my neck and shoulders, twisting into patterns that didn't belong. They didn't move, but they pulsed faintly, a rhythmic beat I could feel in my fingertips. The thread below my collarbone glistened. I grabbed the tweezers, gripping the strand as tightly as I could. I hesitated for a moment, nausea twisting my stomach into knots. Then I pulled. It resisted. The thread didn't slide free like the first one. It dragged, catching on something deep inside me. My skin stretched around it, puckering as I pulled harder, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. There was a sound, faint and wet like suction. Finally, it gave way. The thread slid free with a pop, coiling in the sink like a discarded worm. Black ichor welled up from the pore it left behind, thick and foul-smelling, its scent like burnt sugar and decay. I stumbled back, gripping the counter for support. My chest heaved as I tried to breathe, the air around me thick and sour. The itch didn't stop and it spread further, my arms and legs tingling, the sensation growing more insistent by the second. I clawed at my skin, desperate to feel clean, to feel normal. My reflection shimmered in the corner of my eye, distorted by the flickering light. I looked down at my arm. Another thread had already emerged, darker and thicker than the last. I couldn't stop staring. By morning, they were everywhere. I sat on the bathroom floor, my back pressed against the cool tile, the tweezers trembling in my hand. The sink was full of them, black, glistening threads tangled in thick, oily knots. Some had coiled around the drain, their tips twitching faintly as though they were alive. The itch hadn't stopped. It had taken over. My arms, my chest, my legs, every inch of me was covered in them. They rose from my skin like weeds breaking through concrete, their roots tangled deep beneath the surface. The more I pulled, the worse it got. Each thread was harder to remove than the last. They were thicker now, tougher, like wires embedded in flesh. My skin stretched grotesquely as I yanked them free, puckering and tearing, leaving behind swollen red craters that oozed a foul-smelling black ichor. The room stank of it, sweet and rancid, clinging to the walls and my skin. I clutched the tweezers tighter, my breath ragged. Another thread had emerged on my forearm, curling slightly at the tip like it was beckoning me. I grabbed it, my hand trembling as I squeezed the metal tight. This one didn't slide free. It fought. The resistance was unbearable, like pulling a nail from wood. My skin bulged as I tugged harder, the flesh around the pore tearing slightly, releasing a fresh wave of that thick, oily blackness. The sound it made, the wet, slurping pop as it finally came loose, made my stomach lurch. I dropped the thread onto the pile in the sink and gagged, wiping my mouth with the back of my trembling hand. But the itch wasn't just under my skin anymore, it was in the walls. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. The corners of the bathroom shimmered faintly, rippling like the shimmer of air over an open flame. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, but the distortion didn't stop. The tiles were bending. They stretched inward, their edges warping and curling as though the walls were no longer solid but fabric being tugged from the other side. A low hum began, faint and vibrating at the base of my skull. It wasn't loud, but it filled the room, a soundless pressure that made my teeth ache. My hand drifted to my neck instinctively, feeling for the next thread. My fingers brushed something warm. This one was thicker than the others, buried deep under the skin of my collarbone. It pulsed faintly under my touch, beating in time with the hum that now echoed through the room. I didn't want to pull it, but I had to. I couldn't stop pulling. The thread under my collarbone was tougher than the rest, its texture coarse and uneven, like pulling a thick root from dry soil. My arm shook with the effort, my knuckles white as the tweezers dug into the strand. It refused to move. The hum grew louder, vibrating in my teeth, making the room tremble faintly around me. I bit down hard, bracing myself, and yanked. The thread came free with a wet, ripping sound, and I stumbled back, nearly dropping the tweezers. My chest felt hollow, the skin around the pore puckered and raw, a thin stream of black ichor dripping down my collarbone. The thread dangled from the tweezers, impossibly long, twitching faintly as though it were alive. It was heavier this time, its oily surface reflecting the harsh fluorescent light in sickening streaks. And then I saw it move. Not just twitch, it coiled, curling in on itself like a snake testing its boundaries. My breath caught in my throat as it slithered free of the tweezers, dropping to the floor with a soft, wet slap. It crawled toward the wall. I watched in stunned silence as the thread wriggled across the tile, leaving a slick black trail in its wake. When it reached the base of the wall, it paused, shivering slightly, before burrowing into the corner. The wall rippled. At first, it was subtle, a faint shimmer, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a single drop of water. But the ripples grew, spreading outward, distorting the edges of the tiles. The grout lines bent and twisted, their straight edges curling into impossible spirals. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision, but the distortion didn't stop. The wall folded inward, its surface stretching as though something was pulling it from the other side. The hum became a roar, shaking the floor beneath me. I pressed myself against the counter, my knees buckling as the room trembled. Then the first thread emerged. It slid through the warped surface of the wall, impossibly long, impossibly black, glistening with that same oily sheen. More followed, twisting and writhing, coiling together in a pulsating mass that seemed to grow with every passing second. The knot began to form. I couldn't move. The threads writhed in the center of the room, their movements too deliberate, too coordinated to be random. They twisted around each other, weaving into a tangled, shifting knot that pulsed with a faint, sickly glow. The light hurt to look at. It wasn't bright. It was wrong. It seeped into the edges of my vision, warping the space around it, bending the air like ripples spreading across a still pond. I tried to step back, but my legs wouldn't respond. My chest heaved, my breath shallow and ragged. The threads coiled tighter, the knot rising slowly, twisting itself into something larger. Then it stopped. The hum fell silent, the room stilled. From the center of the knot, something opened. It wasn't an eye. It wasn't a mouth. It was a void, blacker than the threads, blacker than anything I'd ever seen. The edges of it shimmered, folding inward, swallowing the light around it. And then it looked at me. I couldn't breathe. It wasn't fear, not just fear anyway. It was something deeper, something primal, carved into the marrow of my bones. That void, that thing staring back at me, pressed down on my chest like a great weight, smothering every instinct that told me to run, to scream, to fight. The knot didn't move, it didn't need to. The absence at its center, its hollow, devouring gaze, held me in place. I felt it, not physically, but inside, in my head, in my skin. A faint pull, like gravity turned sideways, tugging at every part of me. My arms hung limp at my sides, my legs frozen to the floor, as though the threads inside me were answering some unseen call. The knot pulsed once and the walls shifted again. I glanced around wildly, searching for something, anything that could anchor me to reality. But the room was no longer a room. The walls were rippling fabric, folding and bending in impossible ways. The ceiling stretched upward, infinitely high, the light above flickering and dimming until it was swallowed completely. My reflection in the shattered mirror caught my eye. I didn't recognize myself. My skin was too pale, almost translucent, with black veins spidering beneath the surface. Threads sprouted from my neck and arms, long and wiry, wriggling faintly as though alive. My mouth hung open, trembling, black ichor streaking the corners of my lips. The knot pulsed again. The pull became stronger, dragging me forward inch by inch. My feet scraped against the tile, my muscles screaming in protest, but I couldn't stop myself. It was inside me. The knot wasn't just pulling me physically, it was unraveling me. I could feel it. Every thought, every memory, every piece of who I was fraying at the edges. No, I croaked, the word weak and hollow in the oppressive silence. My hand shot out instinctively, gripping the counter for support. My nails scraped against the surface, black streaks trailing behind. The knot twisted. From the void at its center, something shifted. Tendrils emerged, thin and writhing, each one glistening with that same oily sheen. They reached for me, moving with a deliberateness that made my stomach churn. One of them brushed my cheek. It wasn't cold. It wasn't warm. It was nothing. A sensation so absent it left my skin aching in its wake. The knot pulsed a third time, and I fell to my knees. I hit the floor hard, my knees cracking against the tile. The impact sent a jolt of pain through my legs, but it barely registered against the pull, the relentless gnawing pull from the knot. The tendrils wrapped around my arms and shoulders, their touch light yet unbearable. They weren't like the threads I'd pulled from my skin. These were alive, shifting, exploring, as if they were searching for something beneath my flesh. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat. The knot pulsed again. A wave of pressure swept through the room and my body convulsed. I clutched my chest, gasping, as something deep inside me began to move. It wasn't my heart. It wasn't my lungs. It was them. Threads. Dozens of them burst from my skin at once, coiling and twisting as they emerged. They came from everywhere: my arms, my legs, my stomach, my neck. Each one dragged free with a wet, tearing sound, leaving behind gaping pores that oozed black ichor. The pain was indescribable, but the worst part wasn't the pain. It was the emptiness. With every thread that left me, I felt less of myself. My thoughts frayed at the edges, splintering into static. Memories surfaced and dissolved in an instant. My mother's voice, the smell of rain, the way sunlight felt on my skin. They slipped away like water through my fingers, leaving only a hollow ache in their place. The tendrils tightened, pulling me closer to the knot. My vision blurred, the edges of the room folding inward like the pages of a book. The hum returned, deafening now, vibrating through my teeth and skull until it felt like my entire body was coming apart. And then the knot spoke. Not in words. It wasn't a voice. It was inside me, a vibration that rattled my bones and twisted my thoughts into incomprehensible shapes. I couldn't understand it, not fully, but I felt its meaning, its intent. You are not separate. The threads from my body surged toward the knot, joining the mass, weaving themselves into the pulsating void. I tried to grab at them, to hold on to something, anything, but my hands passed through them like smoke. You are the thread. The knot swelled, the tendrils dragging me into its center. My body crumpled, folding inward as my skin, my muscles, my bones unraveled into long, glistening strands. My vision narrowed, my thoughts reduced to a single desperate whisper. I'm not ready to go. But the knot didn't care. My fingers dissolved first. I watched as they stretched and unraveled, each strand pulling away from the others, fraying into thin black threads. They twisted into the air, drawn toward the knot as if it were a magnet, weaving themselves into its pulsating mass. The pain didn't matter anymore. It was the emptiness, the hollow sinking void left behind as I disappeared piece by piece. My hands were gone. My arms followed, the skin and muscle peeling away in long, glistening strips. I tried to scream, but my throat was already unraveling, the threads twisting upward from my chest, my jaw, my tongue. And still the knot grew. It wasn't just pulling me apart, it was taking me. Every thread that left my body carried something with it. A thought, a memory, a fragment of what made me. I saw my mother's face again, clear for just a moment, her soft hands brushing my hair when I was a child. I tried to hold on to her, to that memory, but it slipped through my fingers as the strands left me. The knot pulsed and the memory shattered into static. My legs buckled, what was left of them collapsing beneath me. My torso twisted and stretched, the threads pulling free like yarn unraveling from an old sweater. My chest opened, my ribs fracturing into thin black tendrils that writhed toward the knot. I wasn't me anymore. The knot consumed me piece by piece, and with each fragment I lost, the room folded further inward. The walls weren't walls anymore. They were fabric, fraying at the edges, folding and twisting into impossible shapes. I saw glimpses of what lay beyond, a void that wasn't empty but full of motion. Shifting shapes, writhing tendrils, infinite and incomprehensible, stretching into a darkness that swallowed time itself. The knot pulled harder. My vision flickered as my face began to unravel, the skin peeling back from my cheekbones, the threads from my skull joining the growing mass. My thoughts were no longer my own. The hum was inside me, erasing, rewriting, consuming. You are the thread. The words vibrated through me as my final thread pulled free. The last of me unraveled. I felt it, every piece of my being, my flesh, my thoughts, my memories, stretching into the void, winding into the knot's pulsating infinite mass. There was no pain anymore, no fear, only the overwhelming pull, a force so vast and absolute that resistance was meaningless. My vision dimmed as the knot consumed me entirely. My body was gone, my mind dissolving into static, fragmented pieces snapping apart like threads cut by invisible shears. And then, I was inside it. The knot wasn't just a mass of threads. It wasn't a thing, not in the way the world had taught me to understand things. It was everything. Every fiber of existence, every moment, every thought, every sound, woven together into a tapestry so immense and intricate that my mind couldn't comprehend it. It was the universe, and it was falling apart. The walls of the room folded inward, twisting and collapsing into themselves. The floor gave way beneath me, the tiles splitting into long black tendrils that stretched toward the void. The hum became a roar, a deafening, all-encompassing vibration that shook the fabric of reality itself. Time fractured. The air grew heavier, pressing down on the knot as it pulsed faster and faster. Every beat sent shockwaves rippling through the space around it, tearing holes in the world. Through those holes, I glimpsed what lay beyond, a churning expanse of chaos, infinite and shifting, where light and dark blurred together in violent, writhing patterns. The threads that had once been my body wove themselves into the knot, disappearing into its endless spiral. And with every thread, the knot grew larger, brighter, more unstable. Reality trembled. The walls dissolved completely, leaving me suspended in the void. The knot was all that remained, its tendrils stretching outward, pulling the world apart strand by strand. And then, with one final pulse, it unraveled. The knot exploded outward, its threads snapping and twisting into the void. They tore through the fabric of reality, ripping apart the last remnants of structure and form. The universe didn't fall, it unwove. Stars dissolved into streaks of light, spiraling into the knot's collapsing center. Time unraveled in jagged bursts, moments folding into one another before stretching into nothingness. I felt myself dissolve with it. The last fragments of my consciousness stretched thinner and thinner, spiraling into the chaos, merging with the threads that once held everything together. For one infinite moment, I was part of it all. The tapestry, the knot, the void. I could see everything, feel everything, the vastness of existence laid bare before me. And then, there was nothing. As the last thread slipped into the void, I realized I was never unraveling the world. The world had always been unraveling me.